They handed my sister a $500,000 legacy, but for me, my parents handed me a bill for every meal I'd ever eaten and called me a leech. I am Rosabella, and they thought they had buried me in the Chicago dirt. They didn't realize I was a seed. Now, 3 years later, as they stand at my gates trembling and begging for a lifeline, they finally see the truth. I don't just have money. I own the very ground they're standing on. But my climb to this throne didn't start with a paycheck. It started with a betrayal so cold it froze my heart solid, in a place where luxury was just a mask for cruelty. The memories hit like a physical weight, dragging me back through time, pulling me into the suffocating opulence of a life I had to die to escape. It always starts with that smell, that cloying metallic scent of a house that has everything except a pulse. The air in the Winnetka mansion always tasted like old money and filtered silence. My father, Hiram, liked it that way. He believed that if you polished the mahogany long enough, the wood would eventually forget the scars of the tree it came from. Tonight, the scent of expensive white lilies was so thick it felt like a physical weight, pressing against the gilded ceilings of the ancestral estate. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, clutching my leather portfolio to my chest like a shield. It was my 21st birthday, a milestone that should have felt like a beginning. Instead, as I watched the baccarat crystal chandeliers shiver under the weight of the Chicago wind outside, I felt like a guest at my own funeral. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your DNA, yet felt like you were a ghost haunting your own life? That was my reality. Across the room, my mother, Mina, was fussing over Sable's silk dress. Sable, the golden child, the one who inherited the family's arrogance without any of its industry. They were the center of the universe, and I was merely a satellite, expected to provide a silent orbit. I looked at the business plan tucked inside my folder, a vision for sustainable architecture that I had bled for over 3 years of university. I believed that a family should be a harbor, a place where you are encouraged to grow, not a courtroom where you are constantly on trial. I took a deep breath, smoothing my dress. I reminded myself that my value wasn't determined by the temperature of this room. "Rosabella, stop hovering." My mother's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp as a paper cut. She didn't look at me. She was too busy adjusting the pearls on Sable's neck. "You're blocking the light for the photographer!" I stepped back, the familiar sting of being an afterthought washing over me. I smiled, a practiced, hollow thing, and waited. I still had hope back then. I still believed that if I showed them my brilliance, they would finally see me. I didn't realize that some people only look at you to see their own shadow. The music stopped. Hiram stepped onto the dais, his presence commanding the room's attention. The elite of Chicago's business world fell silent, their eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a grand gesture. My father loved an audience. "Tonight is about legacy," Hiram declared, his voice echoing with a manufactured warmth. "It's about investing in the future of the Hiram name." He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He beckoned Sable forward. "Sable, my dear, to celebrate your grace and your place in this family, your mother and I are providing you with a $500,000 savings account to kickstart your social ventures." The room erupted in applause. Sable beamed, clutching the book to her chest as if she had earned every cent. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was now or never. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but clear. "Father, I also have a vision for the Hiram legacy. I've developed a sustainable architectural firm model that—" Hiram's gaze shifted to me, the warmth vanishing instantly. It was replaced by a clinical, devastating disappointment. "Rosabella, please," he sighed, the sound echoing through the microphone. "Not now. Your hobbies are unprofitable vanities. We are talking about real business, not art school fantasies." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I didn't back down. "It's not a hobby, Father. It's a viable firm. I just need a small fraction of what you just gave." Hiram didn't let me finish. He reached into a manila envelope held by his assistant and slid a thick stack of papers across the mahogany table toward me. "Since you're so interested in finances, let's discuss yours." I looked down. It wasn't a gift. It was a detailed, multi-page ledger titled Invoiced Cost of Upbringing. My breath hitched. I flipped through the pages. It was a clinical list of every expense incurred on my behalf since I turned 18. Food, housing, prorated utilities, tuition, even a percentage of the household staff's salary. At the bottom, a total that made my vision blur. "You are 21 today, Rosabella," Hiram said, his voice cold and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You want to be a businesswoman? Then sign this promissory note. It acknowledges your debt to this estate, to be repaid with 5% interest. Otherwise, you are a financial liability we can no longer justify." The silence in the room became absolute. I looked at my mother, Mina. I expected to see a flicker of maternal instinct, a shred of mercy. Instead, she looked at me with refined disgust. "Hiram is right," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "We have carried you long enough. You've been nothing but a leech, draining our resources while Sable builds our brand. It's time you earned your own keep." Sable smirked, the $500,000 book pressed against her heart like a trophy. "A leech," I whispered. The word felt like a physical blow. I looked at the papers, then at the people who had brought me into this world. I realized then that when someone shows you who they are, you must believe them the first time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a strange, icy clarity settle over me. "I see," I said, standing tall. My voice didn't shake this time. "Thank you, truly. You've given me the most valuable gift I could have asked for today. You've given me clarity." I looked at my father. "I recognize you as my parents, but I reject you as my creditors." I didn't sign the paper. I closed my portfolio, leaving the nurturing invoice on the table amidst the half-eaten hors d'oeuvres and expensive champagne. I realized that some bridges are meant to be burned so that you can use the light to find your way out of the dark. I turned my back on the room, on the money, and on the life I thought I wanted. I walked through the grand foyer, leaving my coat behind. I took nothing but my car keys and the dignity they tried so hard to strip away. As I pushed through the heavy oak doors, the cold Illinois rain hit my face. It felt honest. I reached into my purse to call a friend, but my phone screen was black. A message flashed. "Account disconnected. Please contact the primary account holder." Hiram hadn't even waited for me to leave the driveway. I stood there, the rain soaking through my silk dress, realizing that the girl who had walked into that mansion 4 hours ago was gone. She had been erased. And for the first time in my life, I was completely, terrifyingly free. The Greyhound terminal in downtown Chicago was a monument to transit and despair, smelling of stale coffee and industrial-grade floor wax. I sat on a hard plastic bench, huddled into my damp silk dress, watching the city's gray morning light filter through the grime-streaked windows. For the past 2 weeks, I had lived like a ghost, drifting through public libraries just to stay connected to a world that was rapidly locking me out. Being family doesn't give someone a license to destroy your future. Yet as I stared at the flickering computer screen in the corner of the station, I realized my sister was doing exactly that. I found it on the 3rd page of my social media feed. A video titled, "The Truth About My Sister." Sable was on camera, her eyes perfectly moist, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. It was a montage of every low moment I'd ever had, clips of me crying after a failed exam, or looking exhausted after working a double shift at the architecture lab. She had edited them to make me look unstable, a parasitic leech who refused to contribute while her benevolent parents paid my way. The comments section was a shark tank of vitriol from people who didn't even know my name. "Unnatural daughter," one said. "A disgrace to the Hiram legacy," said another. The fallout was instantaneous and surgical. I opened my inbox to find automated rejection emails from 3 architectural firms where I had been a top candidate. One recruiter, a woman who had previously praised my sustainable design models, sent a blunt private note. "We saw the video, Rosabella. We cannot risk our firm's reputation on someone with your documented mental history and lack of integrity." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. I didn't feel hate. I felt a profound, hollow sorrow for Sable. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I understood then that I could no longer save her from her own insecurity. I could only save myself from her shadow. Looking back now, I should have seen that this was only the beginning of my erasure. Desperation drove me to the bank. I needed to withdraw the meager $4,000 I had saved from summer internships just to afford a room in a boarding house. The teller, A young man who wouldn't meet my eye typed my information into the system and froze. "I'm sorry, Miss Hiram. Your account has been flagged and frozen." My heart dropped into my stomach. "On what grounds?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He slid a printout across the counter. It was a high-interest predatory loan for a failing boutique fashion line, totaling nearly $60,000. Sable had used my social security number and birth certificate, the ones she'd taken from my desk weeks ago, to list me as the primary guarantor. My credit score was a smoking ruin. I stepped away from the counter and called Hiram from a payphone. I expected a lie, but my father was chillingly pragmatic. "Sable needed the liquidity to maintain the family image after your little stunt at the party," he said, the sound of a clinking ice cube audible over the line. "You don't have a life or a career to ruin yet, Rosabella. Consider this a contribution to the house that fed you for 21 years. It's a debt you've always owed us." He hung up before I could tell him that identity theft was a felony. But what was the law against a man who practically bought the judges in this city? I realized they weren't just abandoning me, they were stripping me of the right to exist independently. Have you ever been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to be your fortress? I walked back to the shared basement workspace where I'd been keeping a few boxes of my architectural sketches. I knew I couldn't go to the police in Chicago. Hiram's influence was a web that spanned every precinct. I had to choose the great silence. I spent the afternoon packing my life into 2 suitcases, moving with a numb mechanical efficiency. The world as I knew it had ended, and the only person left to rebuild it was the girl they called a failure. I sat in the corner of that dark basement, my knuckles whitening around the handle of my luggage, realizing that the best revenge was simply to not be like my enemy. "You look like you're heading for the edge of the world, Rosabella." The voice belonged to George, an elderly freelance writer who used the desk next to mine. He was 70, with a face like a crumpled map and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't ask for my story. He just looked at my suitcases and then at my shivering frame. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick, hand-knitted wool scarf and a Greyhound bus pass. "I was going to visit my sister in Seattle, but my knees aren't up for the trip. Take it, and take the scarf. The mountains get cold this time of year." I accepted the gift with a soft, broken thank you. Sometimes a stranger provides the warmth that blood relatives refuse to offer. I didn't know then that this small act of kindness would be the first brick in the foundation of my new life. I stood on the Greyhound platform at midnight, the Chicago skyline a jagged crown of glass and steel behind me. I took my SIM card out of my phone, snapped it in half, and dropped it into a trash can. I deleted every social media account, every digital footprint that linked me to the girl who had tried so hard to be a Hiram. I bought a one-way ticket to Bozeman, Montana, a place so far from the polished mahogany of Winnetka that it might as well have been another planet. I boarded the bus and took a seat in the back, the wool scarf wrapped tight around my neck. As the driver pulled the heavy vehicle out into the night, I caught a glimpse of the station's television hanging over the boarding gate. A local news broadcast was featuring a segment on the Hiram Philanthropy Gala. There was Sable, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my entire education, being hailed as the Philanthropist of the Year for her donations to youth fashion initiatives. She was smiling, holding a crystal award aloft, using the very funds she had stolen from my future to buy her public redemption. I watched her image shrink as we merged onto the I-90. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. I simply watched the city lights fade into the blackness of the plains, realizing I wasn't just leaving a city. I was leaving a graveyard of who I used to be. The graveyard was quiet, but under the frozen soil of the distance, I felt the first stirrings of a will they couldn't bury. The wind in Bozeman doesn't just blow, it carves. It's a relentless, biting force that strips away everything superficial, leaving only the bone-deep reality of the land. For 6 months, I had lived in a basement studio that made my Chicago apartment look like a palace. I spent my days working in a local land title office, filing dusty deeds and cross-referencing topographic maps until my eyes burned. I was battling a severe fever that night, the chills racking my body as I stared at a complex zoning report. I remembered an old proverb: "The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." I wasn't just surviving. I was grounding myself in the very earth that everyone else had overlooked. "You're still here, Rosabella." The voice was like dry parchment. I looked up to see Vance, the senior land attorney, standing in the doorway of the filing room. He was a man who looked like he had been built from Montana granite, weathered, sharp, and immovable. He walked over to my desk and looked at the margins of the mundane filing work I had been doing. I had been sketching architectural drainage solutions for unbuildable slopes in the Gallatin Valley. He didn't see a clerk. He saw a titan in waiting. Vance pulled up a chair, his gaze intensifying. He told me about his own past, about being sidelined by predatory developers in Chicago who played the same games as Hiram. He saw the fire in me that my own father had tried to extinguish. He didn't offer me a partnership out of pity. He offered it because he knew that the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it. That night, over a lukewarm cup of tea and a stack of legal briefs, the land hunter was born. I realized then that I was shifting from a girl who had been erased to a woman who was about to write her own history. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that your greatest struggle was actually your greatest teacher? While researching a complex land swap a few weeks later, my phone, the new one, bought with my first real Montana paycheck, vibrated. It was an anonymous message from a burner account. I opened it to see a single high-resolution photo from Sable. It showed a massive yellow bulldozer idling in the center of what used to be my grandmother's heritage garden in Winnetka. The hydrangeas she had planted with her own hands were already crushed under the treads. Hiram had sanctioned the destruction of the only place I ever felt safe, just so Sable could have a vanity pool for her Instagram wellness content. I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I felt a total, clinical freezing of my remaining sentimental ties. I understood then that family is a title earned through loyalty, not a right granted by birth. My parents hadn't just rejected me, they had officially abdicated their humanity. I closed the laptop with a quiet click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent office. I looked at Vance and said, "They think they are burying my past, but they are just fertilizing my future." We began to move with a surgical precision that would have terrified Hiram. Using Vance's legal shield and my own architectural knowledge, I started identifying unbuildable land parcels that the Hiram Group had undervalued during their brief, arrogant foray into the Montana market years ago. We executed complex land swap agreements and conservation easements, locking up the water rights and access points that Hiram desperately needed for his planned Bozeman expansion. It was all 100% legal, a masterclass in American property law that left him with no recourse. I insisted that every hectare we acquired remained ecologically sound. I wanted to prove that you can build an empire without destroying the earth or the people on it. A stark contrast to the scorched earth policy of the Hiram legacy. I was no longer the girl who was called a leech at her own birthday party. I was the architect of a massive estate that was beginning to span hundreds of hectares of pristine mountain valley. Every deed I signed felt like a reclamation of my soul. I was building a fortress of quiet power, where their voices could never reach me again. Looking back, I realized that the soil of Montana didn't care about my pedigree or my father's bank account. It only cared about my vision and the strength of my will. I spent my weekends walking the perimeters of my new holdings, the biting wind no longer a threat but a companion. I felt the weight of the land beneath my boots, a solid, unshakable truth that no smear campaign or fake invoice could ever take away. I was finally breathing air that didn't belong to Hiram. I stood on a high ridge overlooking the Gallatin River as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows over the valley. I looked at the vast, open horizon and realized for the first time that my name didn't belong to Hiram anymore. It belonged to this land. This land didn't ask for my apologies or my pedigree. It only asked for my vision, and I was about to give it everything. I had found the ground I was meant to stand on, and from here, I could see the storm they were bringing toward me, but I was no longer afraid of the rain. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of my executive office at the verdant crest, watching the late afternoon shadows stretch across 400 hectares of Montana wilderness. 3 years had passed since I walked out of that Chicago mansion in a soaked silk dress. Today, I moved with the quiet, anchored confidence of a woman who had built her own foundation, stone by sustainable stone. My life was no longer a satellite orbiting someone else's ego. I was the architect of this empire. Looking back now, I should have seen that my silence was a fortress they were desperate to breach. Vance sat in the leather chair across from my desk, his face a weathered map of legal battles won and lost. He slid a digital tablet toward me, showing the latest forensic report on the Hiram Group. Their prestige was crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a gale. Sable's philanthropic fashion line had collapsed into a mess of predatory debt and unpaid vendors, dragging Hiram and Mina into a swamp of commercial litigation. I felt no joy in their downfall, only a heavy, clinical recognition of the truth that character is destiny. They were finally reaping the harvest of the seeds they had sowed with such arrogance. "There's something else, Rosabella," Vance said, his voice lowering. He tapped a file labeled urgent. An unexpected communication had arrived from Mina, not through a lawyer, but through a private, tear-streaked video message. She claimed to be in the final, agonizing stages of a terminal illness. Her voice was a fragile rasp as she begged for one last meeting to pass on our grandmother's original engagement ring. She called it an act of reconciliation, the only piece of heritage Hiram hadn't yet sold to cover their losses. It was a classic emotional hook, designed to bypass my logic and strike at the softest parts of my memory. Have you ever wanted to believe a lie just because the truth was too heavy to carry? For a brief, foolish second, I smelled the lavender scent of my grandmother's garden. I felt the phantom weight of that ring on my finger, but I had been raised in a courtroom of disappointment, and I knew that in the Hiram family, even love carried a hidden interest rate. I handed the tablet back to Vance. "Perform a forensic audit on every document attached to this gift," I instructed, my voice flat. "Check the metadata, the fine print, and the medical certificates. I want the truth, not the theater." Vance's investigation didn't take long. 2 hours later, he returned with a grim, knowing smirk. The acceptance of gift document Mina wanted me to sign wasn't a simple receipt. Hidden deep within the boilerplate legal jargon of page 14 was a personal guarantee clause. The moment my pen touched that paper, I would have legally bound myself and my entire estate to the Hiram family's $2 million commercial debt. The fake illness was a masterpiece of manipulation, an orchestrated ploy to exploit my lingering kindness to save their failing skins. In that moment, I understood a fundamental truth. Mercy without justice is not compassion, it is self-destruction. They didn't want my forgiveness. They wanted my balance sheet. I felt the final shedding of my childhood hope, a quiet, internal snapping of the last tether that linked me to the name Rosabella Hiram. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished. I realized then that my grandmother's ring wasn't a legacy. It was a hook. And I was no longer a fish willing to bite just to feel like I belonged in their pond. I agreed to a Zoom call that evening. I appeared on the screen sitting in my darkened office, my background blurred to hide my location. I didn't look like a grieving daughter. I looked like a strategic investor. On the other end, Mina sat in a hospital bed, surrounded by monitors that weren't even plugged in. Hiram stood behind her, his face a mask of grief that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. "Rosabella, honey," Mina whispered, reaching toward the camera. "Please, just sign the papers so I can die knowing you're taken care of." "The monitors are off, Mina," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "And the medical records you sent were forged on a template from a clinic that closed in 2022. Vance has already traced the acceptance document to Hiram's primary bankruptcy attorney." I watched as the frail facade evaporated. Mina's eyes sharpened, her back straightening as the mask of rage replaced the mask of sickness. Hiram's face turned a deep, mottled red as he realized his clever trap had been dismantled by the very daughter he called a failure. "You ungrateful leech!" Hiram roared, leaning into the camera. "After everything we gave you, you won't even help your own sister? You owe us!" I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I looked him in the eye and said, "I am not your creditor, and I am no longer your victim. I have forgiven you for not loving me, but I will not allow you to use that forgiveness as a weapon against my future. You never asked about my life. You only ever looked for an invoice. I watched the realization of their absolute defeat wash over them as I reached for the end call button. "Don't call me again," I said firmly. "I've spent 3 years building a world where your voices don't matter. I'm finally home." As the screen went black, I didn't feel the weight of their $2 million debt. I felt the absolute lightness of a woman who finally knew she owed them nothing. I didn't know then that while I was closing the door on my past, they were already packing their bags to hunt down the ghost they had created. The weight of their failure hadn't reached me as a physical presence yet, but I could feel it vibrating through the legal reports Vance filed on my desk. While I was closing the door on a past that no longer deserved me, the people who shared my name were watching their own world dissolve. I stood at my office window at the verdant crest, the mountain air finally losing its winter edge, thinking about how some people only realize the value of a foundation once the roof caves in. Have you ever noticed that those who take the most pride in their status are often the first to crumble when the mirrors break? Back in Chicago, the clinical coldness of federal law was finally catching up with the Hiram legacy. I looked at the photos sent by my private investigator. Bright neon seized stickers were being slapped onto the mahogany doors of the Winnetka mansion. Hiram and Mina were forced to stand on the sidewalk, watching as the symbols of their perceived superiority, the baccarat crystal, the antique furniture, even the white lilies, were carried out to pay off Sable's predatory debts. I felt no malice watching them lose it all. I only felt a heavy recognition of the truth that you cannot outrun the harvest of the seeds you sowed. It was during this ruin that Hiram played his last, desperate gamble. He had heard whispers through the industry of a massive green development in Montana that was looking for industrial partners. He believed his years of experience could be traded for a lifeline, a way to claw back into the light. He didn't know that the hidden titan he was planning to court was the same daughter he had billed for her own upbringing. I realized then that their desperation wasn't born of regret, but of a refusal to accept that their reign was over. Looking back, I should have seen that a cornered animal is most dangerous when it thinks it has found a way out. The journey of their hubris began on a Tuesday. Hiram, Mina, and Sable piled into their last remaining vehicle, a luxury SUV that was already 3 months behind on payments. They didn't drive toward Montana to offer an apology or to seek forgiveness. They drove with the intent to conquer a new market, convinced that the world still owed them a seat at the head of the table. Sable, ever the architect of her own delusions, spent the trip planning how she would charm the owner of Verdant Crest. She assumed he was an older man, someone who would be easily swayed by her manufactured social media grace and the Hiram pedigree. The arrival in Big Sky Country was a cinematic clash of scales. Their battered egos, housed in a depreciating car, looked minuscule against the vast, untouchable majesty of the Montana peaks. When they finally reached the high-security perimeter of my estate, they didn't find the red carpet they expected. They found a reinforced gate and a security detail that moved with the quiet efficiency of people who actually have something to protect. They were refused entry, treated with the same clinical indifference they had once shown me. For the first time in their lives, they were the leeches at the gate, begging for a scrap of attention. Frustrated by the locked doors, Sable turned to the only weapon she had left: venom. She used her remaining insider contacts in the media to leak a malicious story to the local Montana business journals. She claimed that the Verdant Crest was nothing but a front for international money laundering and offshore tax evasion. It was a desperate, high-stakes smear campaign, an attempt to force the owner into a public defense. She wanted to create enough noise to make me, the ghost she still didn't recognize, crawl out into the light to beg for mercy. Vance entered my office with the news, his face tight with professional indignation. "The claims are baseless, Rosabella, but they could trigger an audit that would freeze our development permits for months," he warned. I didn't panic. I didn't even raise my voice. I remembered that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the flickering headlights of their SUV parked at the distant edge of my property. "Prepare a defamation suit, Vance," I said calmly. "And then, send an invitation for a formal mediation here at the estate. Let's invite these concerned citizens inside." I spent that evening watching the tiny lights at the gate from my balcony. I thought about the girl who once cried in a Chicago rainstorm because her phone was disconnected. She was gone, and in her place was a woman who knew that the final confrontation wasn't about money or land. It was about who finally held the truth. I felt a strange, quiet pity for them. They had traveled 1,500 miles just to find out that the person they hated most was the only person who could save them. The morning light over the mountains didn't just bring a new day. It brought a storm of reckoning that had been brewing for 3 long years. I could see the SUV moving toward the main house, a slow, dark shape against the gold of the valley. I adjusted my blazer and took a deep breath, the mountain air tasting of pine and iron. I wasn't just defending a business. I was defending the peace I had bled to build. I realized then that sometimes, the only way to truly silence a ghost is to let it look you in the eye and see that you aren't afraid of it anymore. The Montana sky had opened up, pouring down a rhythmic, heavy rain that turned the perimeter roads of the verdant crest into a slurry of gray mud. I stood by the primary drainage culvert, dressed in rugged, oil-stained work gear and a heavy coat that had seen better days. My wide-brimmed hat was pulled low against the wind, obscuring my face as I inspected the silt levels. It was honest work, the kind that leaves you with calloused hands and a clear conscience. I didn't mind the grime. I had learned that the earth is far cleaner than the polished boardrooms of Chicago. A black luxury SUV, caked in road salt and mud, suddenly swerved toward the shoulder, sending a massive spray of freezing sludge directly over me. I wiped the muck from my eyes just as the passenger window hummed open. Sable leaned out, her face a mask of practiced irritation. She didn't recognize me behind the layers of mud and the shadow of my hat. To her, I was just another nameless laborer, a part of the landscape she felt entitled to tread upon. "Hey, you!" Sable shouted over the rain, her voice dripping with the same arrogance I remembered from my 21st birthday. "Scrub the tires on this thing. We can't pull up to the main house looking like we just came from a swamp." When I didn't move immediately, she scoffed and tossed a crumpled $20 bill into the mud at my feet. "There. Consider that a tip. Now go find your master and tell him the Hiram family has arrived to save this place." I looked down at the $20 bill as it soaked in the sludge. Have you ever noticed that how we treat those we believe can do nothing for us is the only true measure of who we are? I felt no anger, only a profound, distant pity. I leaned down, picked up the muddy bill with a steady hand, and simply gestured for the security gate to open. I watched their SUV roll forward toward the trap they had spent 3 years building for themselves. I handed the bill to the security guard at the gate and told him to put it in the local shelter's donation box. Forgiveness isn't about letting people back into your life. It's about removing their power to hurt you. Inside the grand reception hall, the atmosphere was a sharp, clinical contrast to the storm outside. Hiram, Mina, and Sable walked across the heated stone floors, as if they already held the deed to the building. They were met by Vance, who stood by the fireplace with a professional coldness that would have frozen a lesser man. Hiram didn't wait for pleasantries. He signaled his attorney to step forward. "We aren't here for a tour," Hiram declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We are here to settle a family matter before it becomes a public scandal." His lawyer presented a legal notice that was a masterpiece of predatory intent. They were filing for an emergency involuntary guardianship over me. Using the distorted smear campaign video Sable had created years ago, they argued that I, the daughter they believed was hiding somewhere on this property, was mentally incompetent. They claimed my unexplained wealth was evidence of a manic episode and that the entire estate needed to be placed under Hiram's legal control for my own protection. It was a calculated use of the U.S. probate system, a way to seize the hectares Hiram hadn't earned through a perversion of the law. He smiled, that old predatory smile, believing he had finally found a way to win. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall opened with a slow, deliberate creak. I entered the room, no longer the muddy laborer from the road. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that radiated a quiet, unshakable authority. The silence that followed was cinematic, a total shattering of their reality. Sable's mouth hung open. Mina clutched her throat as if she'd forgotten how to breathe. "Rosabella," Hiram whispered, the name sounding like ash in his mouth. "I believe you are looking for the master of the house." I said, my voice clear and steady. I didn't argue about my sanity. I didn't defend my character. I simply nodded to Vance, who handed Hiram a thick, leather-bound folder. While you were busy planning a guardianship, I was busy in the secondary debt market, I explained. Over the last year, I had systematically bought up 80% of Hiram's defaulted commercial loans from the Chicago banks. I wasn't just his daughter anymore. I was his primary creditor. I watched the color drain from Hiram's face as he realized the legal reality. Under the terms of the cross-collateralization clauses in his own contracts, I now held more standing over his remaining assets than he did over my life. I looked at the three of them, the people who had called me a leech while they drained my future, and felt nothing but the peace of absolute boundaries. You came here looking for a savior, I said softly, but you forgot that a savior requires a heart capable of honesty. You didn't want a daughter, you wanted a bank. Even in this moment of total victory, I gestured for the steward to bring them water. I would not treat them as they had treated me. I would act on the foundation of self-respect, not revenge. I will not allow your poison to touch this soil, I told them, the finality of my words hanging in the air like a closing door. Hiram's face turned the color of ash as he realized the master he came to beg from was the daughter he had tried to bury. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the sound of a 30-year-old lie finally collapsing. The executive boardroom of the Verdant Crest felt like a sanctuary of glass and gravity. Outside, the Montana sun was beginning its slow, magnificent descent, bleeding hues of bruised purple and burnt orange across 400 hectares of the valley I now called home. Hiram, Mina, and Sable sat across the polished obsidian table, their presence an oily stain on the room's pristine silence. I watched them, moving with the rhythmic, heavy calm of a woman who had finally closed a vault door on her past. Have you ever noticed that the loudest people become the quietest once the truth finally strips them of their masks? I reached into my leather folder and placed a physical stack of documents on the table. These weren't just papers. They were the legal hammer of reality. These are the original defaulted commercial loans from your Chicago holdings, Hiram, I said, my voice as steady as the mountains outside. I explained the acquisition process with the clinical precision of an architect. I showed them the liens I now held on their remaining vehicles, and the deficiency judgment on the mansion they had already lost. I had spent a year quietly becoming the owner of their failures. Hiram's face was a map of desperate calculation. He tried to straighten his shoulders, leaning forward to claim parental rights over the estate's profits, but I was already ahead of him. I pulled out a single yellowed sheet of paper, the promissory note they had tried to force me to sign on my 21st birthday. I've calculated the exact dollar amount you demanded then, I said, sliding a second ledger toward him. Adjusted for inflation, I've deducted it from your total debt as a final payment for services rendered. We are even now, Father. Success isn't about how much you can take from others. It's about how much you can build when no one is watching. I broke down their financial collapse without a shred of anger, treating it like a failed blueprint that needed to be discarded. Mina began to weep, a soft, practiced sound intended to evoke family unity, but I remained unmoved. I reflected on the wisdom that forgiveness does not mean giving a person a knife to stab you with a second time. Their hubris had died the moment they stepped onto my soil, and no amount of theater could revive it. I turned my gaze to Sable. She was still clutching that muddy $20 bill she had tossed at me earlier, her knuckles white with a shock she couldn't process. I looked at her, then at the massive glass window behind me. You were given $500,000 and a legacy, I said, my voice low. I was given an invoice and a garbage bag of clothes. You turned your everything into a mountain of debt and vanity. I turned my nothing into this. I gestured to the sprawling horizon. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Despite the air of finality, I didn't want their destruction. I wanted my peace. I'm making you a global settlement offer, I stated, sliding 3 identical folders across the table. I told them I would forgive the remaining millions of dollars in debt on one non-negotiable condition. They were to sign a permanent no-contact agreement and a full release of all claims to my estate. I told them clearly, I do not wish you ill, but I no longer wish you in my life. I am not a leech, and I am certainly not an ATM. I am the architect of my own peace. Sable's hand shook as she realized her social media influence and golden child status were worthless in a world of land, law, and integrity. She looked at the documents, then at the sharp, unyielding woman I had become. One by one, they signed. Hiram's signature was a jagged ruin of his former self. Mina's was a faint, trailing ghost. As the last page was turned, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I had not won by seeking revenge. I had won by becoming someone they could no longer touch. Have you ever had to walk away from people who share your blood just so you could keep your soul? I signaled the security detail. The eviction was silent, professional, and absolute. I stood on the great stone steps of the estate house, watching as Hiram, Mina, and Sable were escorted to their SUV. The engine turned over, a hollow sound in the vast quiet of the valley. I didn't wave. I didn't shout. I simply stood there, a silhouette of strength against the gold and purple sky, watching their taillights disappear toward the main gate. Vance joined me on the porch, his presence a comforting weight in the cooling evening air. I turned to him and smiled, a real, weary, beautiful smile. "Thank you, Vance," I whispered, "for seeing the Titan when everyone else only saw a girl in a wet dress." He nodded, looking out over the land we had secured together. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do for the people you love is to stop letting them destroy you. I had rebuilt my life from the frozen soil of Montana, and the foundation was finally solid. I took a deep breath of the mountain air, and for the first time in 31 years, it didn't taste like debt or disappointment. It tasted like the truth, and the truth was that I was finally, irrevocably home. The camera of my mind panned out wide, seeing the tiny car leave the 400 hectares of my legacy. I am Rosabella, and I am no longer anyone's shadow.